Friends, weirdies, wackadoos. Hi, it's so nice to see you again. Thanks for joining me here for another true crime case. We're going to be talking about Jerry Brudos today, and he was a real wackadoodle. Now, this case has a lot of details, a lot of background. As I was outlining it, I realized that it was going to be about twice as long as my typical video is. It is going to be a two-parter, so this is going to be part 1 of 2. I hate to do that to you. I'm so sorry. I know some people really hate two-parters, but just with the timeline editing and also just my camera battery, because I only have one, I'm gonna have to do it to you, and I'm very sorry. Unless you like two-parters, in which case, you're welcome. All right. Let's get into it. Jerome Henry Brudos was born in Webster, South Dakota on January 31st, 1939, into a family that didn't really want him. See, Henry and Eileen Brudos already had a son, Larry, and what they were really hoping for, although they were hoping not to have another baby at all, but when Eileen fell pregnant, they were really hoping to get a little girl. And I have to assume, and this is just conjecture, that they were so disappointed that they didn't even have a name picked out for a boy, because they just went with Jerome, which is Jerry. It's just a name that rhymes with the name they already had for their other son. So I don't think that they thought really hard about it. But that's just my opinion. Jerry's upbringing was fairly unstable. Eileen did not try to make it a secret that she preferred her older son to Jerry. From the time he was really just a baby, she was highly critical of him, constantly berating and humiliating him. Other than that, she was basically completely withholding. Apparently, Eileen was a bit of an ice queen anyway, fairly cold and emotionally unavailable just in everyday life, but she was particularly so to her younger son. Cruel, even. His father, as well, was pretty emotionally unavailable and unsupportive of him. Not really that atypical of a father figure for that time. In the 30s and 40s, people hadn't really caught up to the idea that parents are fully emotionally responsible for their children. So a typical good father would have been one that provided for his family and kept discipline in his home. No one really would have thought anything about a dad that wasn't that hands-on when it came to child rearing. That was generally thought of as the mother's job. So although we don't know, it is highly likely that Henry Brudos probably viewed his wife as almost exclusively responsible for the children. Unfortunately, she wasn't really doing that for Jerry at all. Not helping the situation at home is the fact that the family moved around constantly, so Jerry couldn't even form any kind of positive attachment with other people, peers, or even other adults like a teacher or a neighbor. He was left pretty isolated with his distant father and with a mother that was both cruel and neglectful. Now, a real turning point in Jerry's life happened in 1944 when they were living in Portland, Oregon. Jerry, then just 5 years old, discovered a pair of discarded women's high heel shoes in a dump. And he found those when he was sort of just left to entertain himself alone outside at 5, just to wander the neighborhood. Now, why was this 5-year-old boy left alone to play in a dangerous and filthy junkyard? Well, first of all, it was kind of a different time. I will give them that. Children were much more kind of left to their own devices. You hear a lot of boomers talk about it, even like Gen Xers talk about kind of being kicked out of the house when the sun came up after breakfast and told not to come back until the streetlights came on. Now, the further back in time you go, the age of the child where this was acceptable to do, like how old the kid was, got younger and younger and was still considered acceptable. So 1944, it may not have been that terribly unheard of for a 5-year-old to be sent outside to play alone. It's possible that his older brother Larry was supposed to be looking after him and just decided not to. The other part of this, though, is that his mom just didn't really love him. She didn't love him. She didn't really care about him. So sending him outside where he could potentially get hurt probably didn't faze her that much. She really was like a really terrible parent to him. Apparently she was great to Larry. She was a good mother, doting, affectionate to Larry. But for Jerry, not so much. Okay, so Jerry finds these high heel shoes. This little boy is completely fascinated with this footwear. They were like an open-toed pump. They were kind of shiny. And this was unlike anything Jerry had really seen before. His mother was not a flashy woman. She wore sensible footwear. She reportedly did not own a single pair of high heel shoes, and most of her shoes were quite drab, black or brown. She dressed very conservatively. She was not a fashionable woman. And so Jerry is just sort of transfixed on these shoes. He likes them so much that he carries them home with him. Of course, when he got home with these shoes, what did he want to do? He wanted to try them on, right? We've all done this / seen this. Little kids love to put on adults' shoes. It's completely normal behavior for boys to like put on their mom's high heel shoes. I can kind of picture it in my head, just like a little 5-year-old Jerry with his little feet in these way too big for him shoes, trying to walk around with the heels kind of like flopping and thunking on the floor. I don't know, it's just like a cute little scene in my mind. But Eileen did not think that this behavior was cute at all. When she discovered her son walking around in a pair of open-toed pumps, she was pissed off. She yelled at him, she punished him, and then she took the shoes away and burned them right in front of him. Like, set them on fire in the yard and burned them to ash. By the way, if you want to know how to give your kids an unhealthy fixation on an object, you should do what Eileen did, because that is going to create an unhealthy problem with whatever it was that they liked that you violently got rid of. If you want your kids not to do something, this is not the way to go about it. Turned Jerry into a shoe fetishist. Now, I'm not blaming his mom for how he turned out. Obviously, lots of people go through situations like this and don't end up being serial killers, but this didn't help. Okay, it didn't help. Despite his mother's really extreme reaction, Jerry was not in the least bit dissuaded from his fascination with women's shoes. In fact, the opposite, which is a surprise to absolutely no one. By the time Jerry was in first grade, the family had moved yet again, this time to Riverton, California. Would you care to take a guess what kind of shoes little Jerry's first grade teacher wore? If you said heels, you would be correct. Little Jerry was just absolutely smitten. He stared at his teacher's feet all throughout the school day. He wanted to get his hands on those shoes so bad, with that childish enthusiasm, I would imagine. Luckily for him, his teacher kept an extra pair under her desk. He did a little bit of scheming, and he was able to get a hold of those shoes, and he went and hid them in the hopes that he could sneak them back to his house. Apparently, one of his classmates either saw him take the shoes, or it's possible he told somebody that he took the shoes, and this kid goes and narcs on him. So the teacher, understandably, is very angry. She's very mad about her shoes being taken. She yells at Jerry in front of the class about it, and obviously this is incredibly embarrassing to him. Reportedly, he just ran out of the classroom. I imagine that he probably got in trouble with the school, and his teacher called home to tell his mother what he had done. So naturally, he got in trouble at home too. And now everybody at school knows that he's a shoe thief, which sucks. Fortunately, they moved a lot, so he wouldn't be there for very long. Now, around second-ish grade, Jerry starts getting sick, like really sick. In fact, he ends up having to repeat the second grade because he misses so many days that he can't keep up with the work. He can't finish. Within 1 year, he had measles, laryngitis, chronic sore throat, swollen glands all over his body. To top all of that off, he also was plagued with chronic headaches all the time that were so bad, it made it so he couldn't see very well. They actually thought he might need glasses. They tried to correct it with like eyewear, and that had no effect. Probably because they were likely migraines. I am a migraine sufferer, and I can tell you that there are times it is so bad that it does sort of affect your vision, make things seem blurry, or you start losing your peripheral vision, or you get a little squiggle in the middle of your vision. It sounds like that was probably what was going on for Jerry. Apparently nobody thought of that. I don't know if they just didn't diagnose migraine in children back then, or maybe that they just determined that that wasn't going on for him. Like I said, they thought there was something wrong with his eyes. They tested his eyes, and his eye test was completely fine. So what they did is they just gave him glasses anyway. Even though his eyes were fine, they just gave him glasses anyway. That doesn't make any sense at all, but that's what they did. As I said before, this had absolutely zero effect on his headaches. Shortly after this, Jerry's family did move back to Oregon, and they moved around several places within Oregon. As Jerry entered his adolescent years, he started sneaking into the rooms of like sisters of boys he hung out with around the neighborhood to steal the young ladies' bras and underwear. He would also go over throughout neighbors' houses and steal these items off of clotheslines. And for Jerry, this wasn't like a pranking kind of panty raid boys thing. For him, this was a very serious thing that he did not want anybody to find out about, because he would take these undergarments home and he would wear them, and not in a gender dysphoric kind of way, but because it aroused him. He liked sneaking around. He liked doing things that he wasn't supposed to do. He liked the idea that he had this secret that he knew would completely infuriate his mother if she found out. This was really about exerting control over women. As a young teenager, you really only have one woman in your life, and that's your mother. And he had zero control over that relationship whatsoever. So I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me that Jerry was attempting to exert this passive control over other women he didn't really know, because of his lack of control at home. Now, around the age of 13, Jerry found some dirty pictures that belonged to his older brother, Larry. Larry was 16 at this time, and he had this sort of spank bank material in a locked box that he kept in his room. Jerry had found the box, broken the lock, was looking through this explicit material, and Eileen caught him. But rather than turn Larry in to his mom, she probably wouldn't have believed him anyway, but rather than tell her this is Larry's stuff, he just went ahead and took the blame for it and said the pictures were his. Eileen is disgusted by this. She's really disgusted about anything having to do with sex or sexuality. It's all sort of unspeakable and dirty to her. She's, like I said, a really conservative, kind of icy woman. So this is absolutely unacceptable behavior for her. And of course, as always, Jerry is berated, punished, and humiliated for this. Right around the same time, Jerry's, going through puberty. And we all know what happens sometimes at night. Young men, when they hit puberty, they have some nighttime emissions. It's completely normal. But for Eileen, again, this was more evidence of Jerry's filthy disgustingness. Eileen completely shames him for it, forces him to wash his own sheets, berating him the whole way in front of the entire family, just really embarrassing the hell out of him over something that he has literally zero control over. And this is the kind of treatment that he comes to expect. Then around age 16 or 17, Jerry's fantasies start to move beyond women's shoes and undergarments. He begins to spend time thinking, daydreaming, fantasizing about capturing women and forcing them to obey him, specifically them like begging him for mercy. This fantasy becomes his new focus, even as he's continuing to steal shoes and underwear whenever he can. He also starts deciding that he is going to relieve some of the obsession with this fantasy by getting some nude pictures. He wants some nude pictures of some women, and he decides to target an 18-year-old young woman whose underwear he had actually already stolen. Now, I don't know the name of this woman. It doesn't seem to be anywhere, or I would tell you. But he'd already taken some of her stuff, and he sets his sights on her, and he's going to try to get photos of her. So Jerry sets into motion this rather elaborate scheme to try to get her alone. He approaches her and tells her that he has information about who stole her undergarments. And if she'll come to his house, they can talk about it. When she arrives there, she no sooner knocks on the door than she is attacked by a masked man with a knife. He forces her into the house, threatening her with the knife, forces her to take off all of her clothing, and takes several nude photographs of her. After he's done taking the pictures, the masked man flees. Once he leaves, she gets up and she starts putting her clothes back on, and she just bolts out of the house, just runs, starts taking off down the street. As she does this, she runs smack dab into Jerry Brudos, who, very concerned, asks her what happened and says that he was, forced into the barn, a barn on the property, by a man with a mask and a knife who locked him in the barn. Now, she doesn't really pay much mind to Jerry, and she keeps taking off anyway because the masked man actually was Jerry Brudos. Hold your shock. Now, he's never held accountable for this crime, either because it wasn't reported or because it was reported but he wasn't suspected in any way. Probably it just wasn't reported. Now, we know nothing emboldens a criminal like not getting caught. So Jerry decides that he's going to have another go. This time by kidnapping a 17-year-old woman after luring her into his car on pretense of giving her a ride. Now, there's no picture taking this time. He drives this poor girl out to an abandoned farmhouse, basically in the middle of nowhere, and escalates to battery. He beats this poor girl half to death. Fortunately, he was discovered by a couple who was walking, just hiking in the woods nearby. Now, they confront him, and he tries to lie and tell them that, oh no, he's just a good Samaritan, a passerby who discovered this poor girl in such a terrible state, and he was trying to help her. Fortunately, this couple doesn't buy it for a second. They're like, nah, bro, we were born at night, but not last night. They contact the authorities, and Brudos is arrested. Eventually, he confesses, and in his room at home, police find the photos that he had previously taken of that other girl that he assaulted, the matching photography equipment, and, of course, a bunch of inexplicable stolen ladies' undergarments. Subsequently, in April of 1956, Brudos is committed to the Oregon State Hospital, which is a mental institution. Now, I wish I had more information on why he was committed instead of jailed. He had his IQ tested when he was a kid, and he was found to be of completely normal intelligence. I have to assume it was the presence of this women's clothing. It's possible that he told them, or more likely his mother told them that he kind of liked to wear it, or she at least knew about the high heels. Maybe she said that he sort of had a tendency to wear this kind of stuff instead of just collecting it. Because, some nudie pics and assault and battery is not enough to get somebody committed to a mental hospital. Of course, these days, it's unfathomable to us that a person would be committed to an institution just because they had or were suspected to have a paraphilia with heels and undergarments. Now we understand that having a fetish for something, if it's not interfering with your ability to participate in your daily life, is just a normal part of the spectrum of human sexuality. But at the time, we're talking about 1956 here, at the time, they really had not a good awareness, or rather they had a complete lack of awareness and understanding about paraphilia, sexuality, mental illness, and where all three of those things were overlapping and where they just absolutely did not overlap whatsoever. We are talking about a time when so-called cross-dressing, which is the term they used at that time, and homosexuality were both considered mental illnesses by the medical community. Not only that, but they were crimes in all 50 states. Okay, Marsha P. Johnson had not yet thrown her first brick at Stonewall. Anyone who was not just strictly heterosexual and completely vanilla was considered a pervert and mentally ill. So we can't really expect a court system in 1956 to be able to interpret the nuance needed to understand that a man might have and wear women's shoes and undergarments for predatory reasons that have nothing to do with him being incompetent to stand trial, any more than we could get them to understand that gay and transgendered people are not mentally ill. Now, of course, I just want to be very clear that everything I've just talked about is pure speculation on my part. I don't have actually any personal knowledge about why they decided to send him to a mental institution. This is just a little pet theory. Okay, outdated terms warning. We've got some outdated language coming at you. During his psychiatric evaluation, the doctors at the hospital determined that he is a sexual deviant, a fetishist, and schizophrenic. Keep in mind that a diagnosis of schizophrenia back then is not quite the same as it is now. We have a more, just a better understanding of schizophrenia, and it's used to describe a certain list of like mental health symptoms that include specific criteria. Back then, it was just sort of used as a catch-all term for all kinds of what they considered aberrant behavior. And most of those behaviors and ways of thinking are now understood as their own distinct diagnoses. My understanding is that back then, like if you were psychotic or autistic or whatever, there's a chance that you would have been labeled as schizophrenic. And I will remind you that I am not a mental health historian or expert in any way. That's just my understanding. He's diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he does spend the next year receiving residential inpatient treatment. But he is allowed to leave during the day to attend North Salem High School in Dallas, Oregon. Now, it should be noted that his doctors had determined that he was not going to be able to be rehabilitated. He was mentally ill, he was a predator, and there was no amount of treatment that was going to change that. So why he was allowed to attend a regular public high school, I don't know. Despite this initial prognosis, after just 9 months, he was determined to no longer be a danger to the public and released unconditionally. Spoiler alert, their first determination that he was not able to be rehabilitated, that was the correct one. He was a danger to society. But off he goes, back home. He finishes high school. He doesn't do very well. He tries his hand at college, both at Oregon State and at Salem Vocational, but he doesn't really ever show up to class and eventually just drops out. Like many young people, when college didn't pan out, he decided to join the military. I mean, it's a steady job. They're always hiring, so why not? He does manage to make it through basic training okay. But then he confesses to an Army chaplain that he's been having really obsessive fantasies about a Korean girl seducing him. He seems bothered by these, at least bothered enough that he wanted to tell the chaplain about it. Now, this may seem oddly specific. The Korean War had ended like 6 years prior to that, so it hadn't been that long ago. It would have been all over the news. People would have been talking about it. There would be veterans from the Korean War around. So I'm guessing that when he got into the military, because that was like the most recent conflict, that he kind of started thinking about it. And that's why he started fixating specifically on a Korean woman. I'm guessing that these fantasies that Brudos was having were a lot darker than he had actually admitted to the chaplain, because the chaplain basically tells him, hey, if you're having these thoughts that you're bothered by, you should go see the Army psychiatrist. He does do that, and then the psychiatrist has him discharged from the military, citing bizarre obsessions. So I think he was a little more open with the psychiatrist about what he was actually thinking and feeling. And the psychiatrist was like, okay, well, you can't have a gun. You gotta leave. So he's discharged from the military. He moves back home. His parents make him go live in the shed. They should have kept a closer eye on him, because in the fall of 1960, he followed a young woman home, broke into her house, beat her unconscious, stole her shoes, and then brought them home to his little shed room to sleep with, like some kind of bizarro world teddy bear. Presumably his parents didn't know. I do think it's important to note going forward that other than that first young lady, the one that he lured to his house and then dressed as a masked man, other than her, all of Brudos's victims will be attacks of opportunity. He is not pre-vetting these women in any way. They just have the misfortune to be wearing high heels in his presence when the mood strikes him. His fantasies include keeping women as sex slaves, having complete control over their minds and their bodies. He's just a really sadistic dude. And what he's done to 3 women so far, who have all been left alive, is just the tip of the iceberg. So around 1962-63, Jerry gets a job at a radio station. He had been certified as an electrician at this point, and so he worked there doing wiring in that capacity. While working at the radio station, he meets 17-year-old Darcy Metzler, who for some reason is interested in the 23-year-old Jerry Brudos. Her parents are quite disapproving of the relationship, but despite this, or maybe because of it, she is obsessed. She gives all of her attention to Jerry. For him, this is a jackpot. A younger, inexperienced girl who is willing to do whatever he wants, and now has a negative relationship with her parents, so she's completely reliant on him. It is an abuser's dream. So he marries her. He's got to lock that down. Shortly after the wedding, Darcy gives birth to their first child, a girl who they name Megan. Repeating a common occurrence in his own childhood, Jerry moves his family around a lot. He can never seem to hold down a job for very long. But all the while, Brudos has his young wife to help him satisfy some of his obsessions. He forces Darcy to walk around the house in only a pair of heels, to do housework, either completely nude or in heels or in lingerie. This is a daily occurrence. And look, some people are into that, okay? And I am not judging and I am not shaming. This particular situation, though, we are not talking about a consensual act between 2 people, okay? This is a situation of coercive abuse, and I just want to make that clear. A few years after the birth of their daughter, they have another child, a boy that they call Jason. Thing is that this time, Darcy does not allow Jerry to be in the delivery room when Jason is born, and this makes Jerry very angry. He is completely put out by her not allowing him to be in the room. Now, my opinion, this was Darcy's first step in trying to take back her bodily autonomy from her husband. After this, Darcy really puts her foot down, letting Jerry know that she will no longer be acquiescing to his bizarre requirements for fetishized housekeeping. Now, I don't know what finally made her stand up to him, but as a mother, I would guess that it has something to do with her daughter. Her daughter was getting older, getting to an age where she might start recognizing that there was some odd behavior going on in the home. And it's just really amazing. It's amazing how you can find that strength and that bravery that you did not know that you had for the sake of your children. Again, this is purely speculation, but it would not surprise me if that was Darcy's motivation. Unfortunately, now that he's not getting his twisted needs met by his wife, Jerry Brudos gets up to his old tricks, out snatching and obsessing over the panties and shoes of strange women. Not long after Jason was born, Jerry followed another woman home. He broke into her house after she fell asleep, strangled her, sexually assaulted her while she was unconscious, and stole her shoes. Now, back at his home, Jerry had constructed himself a little fortress of solitude in the basement below the garage. His wife and children were forbidden to enter. It was fortified with heavy locks and deadbolts. He had it outfitted with like a buzzer intercom thing, so that the family could get a hold of him while he was in there if he was needed. They were literally not to go in there under any circumstances. Brudos used this room primarily to store his shoe and underwear collection. He would go in there to put them on and look at himself in the mirror. But later, its purpose would become much darker as Jerry began to lose control of his fantasies, which were becoming homicidal. And just a side note, if your partner has a room that they keep locked all the time and you are not allowed to go in there, run. Just as soon as you can, pack up your shit and run away. Red flags everywhere. I should get a little red flag because there are always so many red flags in these cases. I need one to wave around. Your domestic partner should not have a secret room, okay? Just move to the nearest exit as swiftly and safely as possible. Get out. Do not leave a forwarding address. I can't believe I have to say that, but the frequency with which stuff like this happens is alarming. So jump with me now, ahead in time, about a year and a half or so, to May 10th, 1969, when two fishermen discover the body of a young woman floating in Oregon's Long Tom River. When police arrive, they discover that this body is tied to a car part, like an engine part, that's being used as some kind of anchor. It's tied to this part using a nylon rope, and they note that the knot used to secure the car part and the rope is unusual or uncommon in some way. The deceased matches the description of 22-year-old Linda Sallee, a secretary and student at Oregon State University who had been reported missing by her family 17 days prior. Her car had been found abandoned at a local shopping center, but there was no trace of Linda until she was pulled out of that river. Her younger sister, Becky, who was only 10 at the time of her disappearance, remembers her very fondly. Their 12-year age difference made Linda almost like a second mom to Becky. They would go to the movies all the time together. Linda would babysit. They were really close. The last memory that Becky has of Linda is when she was headed out to go shopping for a birthday present for her boyfriend. When Linda never came home that night, never showed up to her boyfriend's birthday party, and did not report to work the next day, her family reported her as missing. An autopsy revealed that Sallee had been sexually assaulted, strangled to death. Her body had been mutilated. There were some burn marks, like 2 little burn marks on her side by her rib cage. They had been done post-mortem, but they couldn't really explain what they were. But it was bad enough that the police knew that they were looking for a seriously sadistic individual. Just 2 days after Salih was pulled out of the river, another young woman was found just literally a few feet downstream. Her body was also weighed down with a car part, with the same nylon rope and the same unusual knot. She was identified as Karen Sprinker, a 19-year-old Oregon State University student who had been missing since March. She had also been sexually assaulted, strangled to death, and her breasts had been amputated. The similarities between the two women, particularly in the method of disposal, led police to the obvious conclusion that they were going to be searching for the same sick individual in both of these cases. The slew of missing persons reports for college-aged women that they had led them to believe that this man was probably looking for women, targeting women on the Oregon State University campus. And yes, that's right. I said slew of missing persons reports, 12 to be exact. 12 women and girls from the area who fit this victim profile. 12 now potentially murdered young women. The police had no way of knowing if or how many of these women could be potential victims of this same guy. So they were very eager to find a suspect. And I think that that's a good stopping point now for part 1. In part 2, we are going to discuss the sting operation that finally brought Brudos to justice. We will talk about his other confirmed victims, and we'll discuss his confession, which is going to tell us why you should not allow your partner to have a secret room. Point blank, period. Thank you so much for joining me today. Don't forget to keep a lookout for part 2. It should be out in just a couple, 3 days. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing that. I'd love to have you. Other than that, please do something to take care of yourself today and every day, and I will see you next time, just a couple days. All right, bye for now.